Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor Jacqui Frost, and we're going to talk about atheist churches. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so why don't you first describe what an atheist church is?
I think the best way for me to describe what an atheist church is to talk about the larger category that I see atheist churches being in, which is secular congregations. So there are a lot of different types of secular congregations, which to me are organizations that sort of mimic a church-like structure, but do so without religion as sort of the main focus. So there are psychedelic churches where the central focus is, taking drugs together and having spiritual experiences in that way. And you can be an atheist there, you could be religious there. There are wellness churches that are really focused on like health and well-being, and you could be of any religious sort of or non-religious identity there. But atheist churches are really organizations that mimic religion for atheists and to sort of celebrate atheism. And so one example that I have studied for a long time is the Sunday Assembly. And so this is an organization of atheists and agnostics and other sort of non-religious types of people. But it is really an organization that is for atheists, for non-religious people who are celebrating being non-religious, who aren't necessarily anti-religious, but who are really focused on non-religion in their services, but they mimic a Protestant church style is often the case in the United States context. So they will have a speaker come talk about a subject. They will sing songs together. They'll have small group meetings throughout the week to sort of build community and those kinds of things. And so that is how I would sort of describe an atheist church.
Is there a difference between a church and a congregation?
That is a great question. Well, I think so. Church is a very sort of one. It's a very Protestant word, I think, and so there's different kinds of religious organizations or religious congregations that don't use the language of church. Also, in the atheist churches that I've studied, some people there are hesitant to use the language of church. And so Sunday Assembly, for example, does sometimes use the language of atheist church, but a lot of people like to say secular congregation is a little bit more expansive. Also, atheist church, right? There's not everybody there is an atheist, so we could get into sort of the identity politics of what it means to be an atheist or an agnostic if you're interested. But there's a lot of different ways to be non-religious, and atheism is just one of them. And so by saying atheist church, there's some discussion among people who attend these kinds of spaces that's not as inclusive of a concept that so secular congregation is a little bit more general. But in my work, I like to, use the language of atheist church to distinguish that kind of space from like the psychedelic church, which is also to me a sort of secular church or a secular congregation, but for a different purpose.
Interesting. Yeah, like when I first heard your work about, atheist churches, I immediately thought about the Ethical Society of St. Louis. And, I
Yeah.
went there for years, okay? And atheist church is like kind of like the term that I would use to describe that place and that, that congregation. Like the building itself is church-like. They meet on Sundays. There's a sermon. They don't call it a sermon, right? But it's
Right.
basically a sermon. They pass around a basket for donations. It was just so similar. They had a daycare, program for, like middle-aged adults and stuff, and, it seemed like it was secular church to me. The vast majority of people who were there seemed to be atheist. I wouldn't say that all of them were. I think many of them had suffered religious trauma growing up, and so they wanted to move away from religion and yet, still belong to some community, and I felt like that was the draw of the ethical society. Is that similar to, like, the experiences that you've had?
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, so ethical societies, Unitarian congregations are often very similar where they are sort of, church-like, but are welcoming to atheists and non-religious people. So there's some differences, I think, amongst these types of spaces, but they're similar. In terms of motivation, I think, particularly, so there was a lot of formerly religious folks who, had left religion, but were interested in maintaining the church like Sunday meetings. They thought that was a great space to build community. They thought especially in my work, I'm interested in the ritual nature of atheist beliefs. So a lot of people think that you can't really ritualize being an atheist, or that like coming together around atheism doesn't really make any sense. But a lot of the atheists at these spaces are interested in, collective singing and in creating rituals that can celebrate what they do believe and their beliefs about, materialism and science and those kinds of things. But another big motivator, I think, in my that I have found in my research is sort of like this trend away from wanting to be a solely intellectual space or um an anti-religious space. So there's a lot. So like in the mid 2000s, there was the rise of the new atheists, which like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and all these sort of scientists and journalists, and they were writing these books that were pretty critical of religion. And there was this sort of um, momentum around sort of an atheist movement that was really political in nature, that was, trying to get "In God We Trust" taken off of our money, that was really sort of focused on church state issues and discrimination against atheists. And so a lot of organizations were focused on those things, and sort of intellectual discussions and legislative discussions. And I talked to a lot of people starting in like 2010 and 2013, when a lot of these churches started. They were like, those are great spaces, and I'm glad they're doing that work, but I'm not really getting a lot of community out of going to, like, the political events or the intellectual discussions. I'm not getting a lot of, ritual. It's not very, emotional based, and so I think a lot of people were seeking out a way to express their non-religion in different ways, and something a little bit more embodied, something a little bit more communal, and not to say that they weren't still interested in the politics of it, but it was sort of this, like, we want a more well-rounded, identity, something that's not just like, "What am I against?" but also, "What am I here to celebrate, and how can I embody those beliefs?" And I've been hearing that a lot as one big motivator for why atheist churches and why has this become sort of a popular thing right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And for me, like I lean towards the intellectual stuff. Like I like that type of environment. I like having intellectual discussions, but I can understand that other people want other aspects to their identity and to their lives. Yeah, and the ethical society, I would say it was pretty well rounded, right? They had a choir, so like they also organized protests, so there was really a little bit of everything involved. And yeah, I can kind of see the appeal to that. And do you think that these atheist churches or secular congregations can replace traditional churches?
Yeah, that's something. So I think it depends on what you're hoping for them to replace, perhaps. So I think, they certainly do, and there's not a lot of actual research, like longitudinal research on these spaces yet, right? So we have a ton of like survey research that tracks religious people over time to like see whether or not this kind of religious involvement impacts your health, or whether this kind of religious involvement like builds your communities, or whatever the outcome is. And so we don't have a lot of research on what these secular congregations actually do for people, but the initial research shows that they do a lot of similar things as a religious congregation would. It helps build community. It tends to increase health and well-being and life satisfaction. It can be a place where a non-religious person can come develop a sort of identity and a belief system around being non-religious. I think that that's something that a lot of people worry about in sort of the rise of the non-religious. So we've grown to about 30% of Americans are at least religiously unaffiliated. That doesn't necessarily mean they're all atheists. Only I think like 5 to 6% of Americans are atheists right now. But if you leave religion, like what, that does mean leaving community. That means leaving places to volunteer through. That means, leaving a central belief system that can be comforting and motivating. And I have found that secular congregations can replace, a lot of those things. There is, of course, a difference in that, the atheist churches that I've studied don't really have a central sort of, here's what you need to do to be a good person kind of narrative, right? It's a lot more like open-minded. They're sort of not interested in having the same sort of structure and dogma as a religious congregation would. And so that can mean there's less, there is less sort of incentive to attend, for example, right? So there's not some sort of overarching reason to go to this space other than your own interest, right? And so I think what it is that we're hoping for them to replace in churches, I think it depends, but I think it can do a lot of those positive things that religious congregations tend to do for people.
I think there's a lot of truth in what you said and kind of mirrors the some of the thoughts that I've had. I think that these secular congregations can replace some functions of a traditional church, but it just seemed to be, in my experience, it seemed harder for me to connect with people because that they were atheist, like, just because that they were atheists, right? Like, it was hard for me to just make these, like, fulfilling connections with people simply because we had some sort of, like, common disbelief, right? I felt like what was more important is what we had, like, in common in terms of what we believe,
Right.
right? And because these secular congregations, or at least, according to what you're saying, if it's true that they don't have, like, this central doctrine about, how to live, I don't know if it can be as good or as unifying or as appealing, uh, than traditional churches, right? Like this, so like in philosophy, there's this phrase called the comprehensive conception of the good, right? This is a phrase that political philosophers use, and it doesn't seem like these secular congregations can offer that, whereas a traditional religion can, right? Like traditional religions, they can answer very important questions that people want answers to, right? They tell us where we came from, how to live, and where we're going. Whereas secular congregations don't really do that or can't really do that. What do you think?
I think they could, and I have been to some types of secular congregations that do that more than others. I think the difference is that they're not most most atheists in the United States aren't interested in having a singular sort of this is the one way, this is the one right way kind of message. And so I think so for example, I've been studying transhumanists lately. There's a transhumanist church in Florida, and they are mainly non-religious people, but they're interested in living forever through scientific advancements. So this can be, genetic editing or um uploading your brain to the cloud. A lot of people are freezing their bodies when they die, those kinds of things. And there's a church based on this that not based for people to sort of build community around, life extension technologies and those kinds of things. And so in that space, there is a little bit more of an imperative to extend your life, to, support certain kinds of scientific advances, to, so in that kind of secular congregation, I think there is a little bit more of a shared belief system around a non-religious belief in the advancement of science. But in something like the Sunday Assembly, I think they offer a number of different kinds of ways to be a good person and ideas for what, why we are here and where we're going that people can sort of grab onto, right? So a lot of them are science-based and materialist, but I think that rather than like saying here's the one version, I think a lot of these spaces are like there's a lot of ways to be a good person, and there's, let's be open about where we came from because there's a diversity of perspectives here. But I do think that you're right that like there is something to the religious, imperative of like here's the way to live and here's the right answer and here's what happens when you die. There is just something different about that kind of belief system that I don't think most secular congregations really want to even offer. But I do think I've seen examples of when they can, and it is a little bit more intentional in that way.
Interesting. Hadn't heard of a transhumanist church before, but I teach a class on transhumanism, so I find that topic
Oh, yeah.
particularly interesting. Yeah, that I don't even know if I want to call that a church. That almost sounds like a meetup or something.
It is called
People.
the Church of Perpetual Life, and they do meet in a church space, once a month.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But that, and now you're making me think of like what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a church? Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
have the answer to that. I once it's okay. So maybe this is one way to think about it, right? So I did my PhD in St. Louis University, and the philosophy department there is extremely Christian. It's very religious. And the sense that I got was that the Catholic Church was more unified than Protestants because they had like some central authority that it wasn't as like separated and segregated as like the different Protestant churches are. Just think of how many different denominations are in the Protestant church and just like how much they disagree, know. So maybe these secular congregations are one step beyond that, right? So a secular congregation is to the Protestant church as a Protestant church is to the Catholic church.
Maybe so. I think, yeah, I think that yeah, I think in the fact that there is a very wide diversity of worldviews within these secular congregations. There's also been schisms in the secular congregations. So, like, in the Sunday Assembly, one of the chapters, a small group thought it wasn't being atheist enough, and so they created their own separate congregation to be sort of more focused on pro-atheism things. And so in that way, I think it does mirror Protestantism in that there are these, like, there are so many different, ways to be atheist, but, like, ways to be non-religious or even more expansive. So we have humanists, we have the ethical societies, we have the Unitarians, we have the atheist churches, we have, the free thinkers, the skeptics, and that we can think about, like, the rationalist communities are wrapped in here in ways too. So I think yeah, I think it's actually a really diverse field that people aren't as aware of, that, like, there's not just one way to think about what it means to be like an atheist church.
Yeah, but they also don't have a holy text, right? Protestants at least have a holy text, right? There's
True.
all these disagreements, but at least there's some sort of holy text. Whereas, like, if you have some sort of transhumanist church versus maybe something like the ethical society, I mean, maybe like there's certain things that they would share, maybe the love of
Right.
science or whatever, right? And maybe they tend to be less religious.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, what do you think is this fundamental need that these congregations are trying to meet?
Yeah, this is something I've thought about a lot. I think it's at least right now, it's a very Western product. So I keep talking about the Sunday Assembly. That's the organization I did my dissertation on, but that's an organization that started in the United Kingdom in 2013. It was started by two comedians who were former Anglicans, and they missed the collective singing that they used to do in church, and so they started initially because they wanted a space to do sing-alongs essentially, and were toying with the idea of making them, church hymns and like singing church hymns as secular people together, but it sort of snowballed into this secular congregation idea. And then by 2015, they had 70 chapters across the United States, the United Kingdom, some in Australia, some in like Germany, but like all of these Western contexts. But especially in the United States, I think that there is a lot of institutional isomorphism going on. So the idea that, like, we mimic the structure of organizations that we're already familiar with, right? And so the most common form of volunteer community, or like community in people's lives in the United States, is the congregational form. And so I've talked to a lot of people who attend secular congregations who said, like, I don't know how else we would create a community. Like, the church form is the best form, like, we just have to take religion out of it, and that seemed, like, it has all the structure that we need, plus you can plug into the nonprofit, application process really easily if you sort of mimic, that structure, or, some of these spaces are doing, getting tax exemption for being of a church structure. So I think some of this motivation is, this is just the only way we know how to build a community that has rituals and sing songs and is emotions based, right? But I think and then there's this motivation because a lot of people in the United States, at least, are formally religious, right? So we've only recently seen this growing number of people becoming non-religious, and so a lot of the people that are non-religious in the United States right now used to be religious, and so they're looking for that replacement in some ways, although a lot of people are, like, not looking for that replacement. So this is, there isn't, again, a lot of research, like national research, on how many people attend these kinds of congregations, but it is a very small proportion of the actual non-religious population who attend. And so I think there's lots of questions on, how long will we, how can will these survive? How long will we see these into the future if not that many people are going? Um, but I think, at least in the United States, I think it's an institutional mimicry thing. There's also a study that shows that the more religious congregations there are in a space, the more non-religious organizations, like the more atheist organizations there are in a space. And so it's sort of and that research sort of talks about an embattled minority kind of drive. So, like, this idea that, like, there are people who are religious who are gathering, and they're saying that we're not moral because we don't gather in this kind of space, and so we're going to, find spaces for to sort of fight back against that stereotype. So I think those are, at least in the United States, a lot of some of the motivations.
Interesting. What do you think is the draw of rituals? I never really understood this. Maybe it's just not how my brain works, but nothing about a ritual appeals to me.
Yeah. It's very polarizing, I would say, in the non-religious field, if I can say that. Like, a lot of non-religious people aren't interested in rituals. I think a lot of religious people aren't as interested in rituals either. I'm not a psychologist. I think there might be some personality differences going on here about like who's interested in, gathering in a space to sing a collective song together, right? Like there's some people who like concerts and some people who don't like concerts. And I think the people who are interested in ritual, that is definitely a driver of these spaces. And I think it's, it's a in particular, I think I've talked to a lot of non-religious people who feel that there aren't ready-made rituals for non-religious people to plug into. So if you're religious, you can go to a church and you can plug into this centuries-old ritual and it can feel meaningful right away. Or if you're getting married, there's a whole script for how to do that in a church. Or if you have a loved one who's died, there's a whole script for how to like make meaning around that and how to symbolize that and how, how to ritualize that. But there aren't those long-standing norms and rituals for non-religious people, and so I know that a lot of humanist societies especially are trying to become those spaces and, like, offer those services, offer ready-made scripts for those spaces. So I think it's, in some ways, I think non-religious people feel that they don't have as many ways to sort of mark different life transitions or, express, an emotion around their belief system in ways that religious people have easy access to. And I think there's a drive to create those for the people who are interested. But I think you're right that not everyone is interested. And even people who have gone to these secular congregations that I've studied, many have left because they're like, actually, I don't like the ritual part of this, turns out. So I think there's something psychologists can study to answer that. But yeah.
Mhm. I remember when I was at the Ethical Society, there were certain things that kind of irked me. And I think it had to do partly had to do with some, like, ritual aspects I just didn't like. So, for instance, before, the sermon, the person would kind of, like, hit this tiny gong, you know? Like, I just felt like it was a little woo-woo. Like, why would you do that? Like, why can't you just say, "We're gonna start now?" You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, there's this extra I don't know what you call it. Maybe it's ritual, maybe it's, like, sentimentalism, like, I don't know what it
Hmm.
is, but I just felt like it was totally unnecessary, right? Another aspect was that as I went, when the leader would say, "Oh, good morning," and everyone in the audience would say, "Good morning," and in
Hmm.
response, like, we're all, like, just, like, on the same level, and we gotta repeat what this
Hmm.
person says. It was kinda weird. I don't like that part either, you know?
Yeah.
Like, but again, I'm the black sheep. I admit that I'm the black sheep, like, I wanna go to a philosophy conference.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've interviewed just as many people like you as people who are interested in it. And I think, yeah. But I also like at these spaces, one thing I'm really interested in is studying sort of how they celebrate science in particular and how they sort of ritualize their beliefs in science in a way that is sort of sacralizing science and particularly sacralizing certain scientists. So for example, we sang Happy Birthday to Carl Sagan at a secular congregation event I went to, read from Pale Blue Dot, right? So he's in a lot of these spaces, sort of a secular saint in a way. Like I've been to a lot of different non-religious events where Carl Sagan is sort of read or talked about or he's pictured somewhere, right? So I think there is an interest in cultivating those kinds of figures and meaning systems, but I also think I know that a lot of them read scientific research, read, things about how we can create certain emotions in our bodies. And so a lot of the Sunday assembly workshops that I had gone to about ritual creation, they were very much like, well, science says that if we look each other in the eyes and we move synchronously, then we can elicit oxytocin. And that is a feeling of that's essentially what spirituality is. Like they want to have these, transcendent experiences, and they are looking into science as a way to understand how to create them physically. And so doing rituals is something that they're interested in, I think, emotionally, but I think also intellectually, a lot of them know that if we do these certain movements and if we, you know, hit a gong at the beginning, then that changes the tone in a way that like science shows can help bond people better or can help us feel the kinds of emotions that we're trying to feel or feel transcendent or whatever it is. So it's I think there's a drive sort of emotionally because we are socialized to believe that that's, how meaning is made, and we see it happen with religious people, but I think there's also this, like, scientific grounding of, like, this is how we can experience certain embodied emotions, and we can do that through understanding how the science of it works, and I think that that's really interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting, and that makes sense. I mean, part of me thought that the main motivation of creating these secular churches was to replace traditional churches. People wanted the community, but didn't want the religion. And that makes perfect sense to me. But what you just said makes me think that there is some need for the divine. There's some need to have access to the transcendent or something like that. Do you think that's true?
I think similar with my answer to the rituals, and I say this about community too. I think some people do have a need for transcendence, for ritual, for community. Some people don't. And I think that both are viable ways to have a meaningful life. And so like I do sort of I'm always, like, hesitant to say, like, all people need a community and all people need ritual, or all people need this, like, experience of the transcendent. I think that some people do, some people want it, and some people are not interested at all. I've interviewed a lot of people who are like, "None of that sounds interesting. I don't think about my existence ever. Like, I'm not interested in," you know, so I think the thing that, like, the average person doesn't think about, though, is that atheists are just as interested in this stuff as religious people are. Like, there are, a lot of atheists aren't, but I think a lot of religious people probably aren't also, right? I think there's a spectrum of interest in and need for these things across the religious and non-religious spectrum, and a lot of my work is just trying to show that, like, there's as much diversity among atheists on this stuff as there is, anyone else.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember I read your article about atheist churches, and there was at least one person who was doing debaptisms.
Mhm,
He was like a blow dryer. I
mhm.
just thought that was so ridiculous. I'm like, come on, man. Like, what
Yeah.
really? Like, what's the point of that? Like, if the baptism doesn't mean anything to you, then why does like if you don't think it's true, if you're rejecting religion, why would you care about getting debaptized? It's just it means nothing. Like, why is that important?
Yeah. I've never actually witnessed a debaptism ceremony, so just throwing that out there. But I have interviewed people who have taken part in them. And so like in some ways it is a sort of humorous thing to do. So they have and this isn't at a secular congregation. The people that I interviewed who did this was there it was more of like um, one of the more political organizations. Like, it was one that was more about, like, politics and legislation, but they did do this event, once a year where you could get debaptized, and a bunch of people would do it, and it was humorous, and they would make jokes, and I think that's there's a lot of research on even in the secular congregations I've studied that are actually very sincere, and they're really not making fun of religion in these spaces. There is always a bit of dry humor in these spaces about religion, about sort of acknowledging that we're mimicking religion to make meaning. So I think humor diffuses some of those tensions. The people that I interviewed that have been debaptized said, like it was funny, but ultimately I saved the certificate that I got. So they'll give you a certificate and they'll say, I framed that certificate. Or especially former Mormons will send it to their church, the former church, to ask to get like taken off of I don't know as much about like the actual words, but Catholics and Mormons have told me former Catholics and Mormons have said like, so I can signal to my former church that yes, I have done a ritual to leave, right? So I think it is a humorous ritual, but I think like there is some meaning that people get from it. Or it's something to symbolize to the people in their life that like, this was I'm taking this seriously. This is an actual, like, ritual that I participated in to change, to shift my identity. But like interestingly, the secular congregations are not the spaces where this is happening. And I think because it is more of a humorous event, but then people take meaning from it. I think it would be for the secular congregations maybe a little bit too on the nose, perhaps a little bit too like irreverent, because, they're really not trying to antagonize religious congregations versus somewhere like the Satanic Temple, which I think of as more of a sarcastic religion, is trying to antagonize, and so maybe I think there's a difference there too.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make. One of my friends in St. Louis, he actually did that, like, where he sent a letter to like his Catholic church, his local Catholic church, to get him off the list or something.
Yeah.
And I just thought that that was so weird. Like I just and I asked him like, why did you do that? You know? And for him, it was essentially symbolic. Like he didn't want them to like it was the principle of him getting off the list, and he didn't want that church to be able to add another number to their statistics of the number of followers, you know?
Yeah.
And I
I
just
think
find
that's
that
very common.
yeah, that's interesting to me because I in my mind, it's just it's almost irrational, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
make sense to me because it's like, what is that gonna do? You know what I mean? Like, if you don't think that this is real, why go through this symbolic process of just, like, taking your name off it seemed like you're just kinda sticking it to the man, you know? Like, because you've had this negative experience with this institution, you're just gonna take that extra step to kinda stick to the man.
Yeah. I think that's true for many of them. I think also we are talking about, like, is there this need for ritual, right? And I think some people do need or want, a transition ritual, like that, they joined a religion with a ritual, and leaving that religion with a ritual makes sense for some people. And I think I think it's hard for some non-religious people to find themselves and find an identity in a set of practices that can help them sustain, their daily lives in the ways that their religion used to. And I think that some seek out like this, like, okay, this transition ritual can help me like mentally move on, emotionally move on. I think some people do. I think ritual can do that for people. Maybe not those of us who aren't as interested in a ritual, but I think it can serve that purpose because if you're religious, there's so many different ways to mark these different life course things, and I think that not some non-religious people are just looking to replace that.
Yeah, I don't wanna sound too harsh and criticize these people who value rituals. It just seems very foreign to me. I'm just not built that way. But I can understand how it may help people heal from whatever
Mhm.
bad experience that they went through. It just
I think so. I've also talked to at least former Mormons who say that like the church will still contact them like regularly and try to re-recruit them. And so like an effort to get off of these lists is in some ways like to get them to stop reaching out to them also.
yeah, I think what this conversation is revealing to me is just how much I dislike rituals. And it is not necessarily like in a religious context. It could be, in any particular context, like funerals,
Yeah.
weddings, like I don't like any of that stuff.
Yeah. I think we need more research on that, honestly, because all of the ritual studies stuff is about people who are in a ritual and whether or not that ritual worked. But like I have encountered many people who are not interested in rituals. But like I think at least in sociology, there's ritual tends to be conflated with meaning. And so if you don't like ritual, it's sort of this assumption that you lead a meaningless life. And that is like inherent in a lot of um research and especially theory about like modernity and secularization, and that as we leave religion we leave meaning and we leave purpose and we don't have like fulfilling lives anymore because we don't have these religious rituals that can give you transcendence. And I push back against that narrative a lot. So even though I am studying non-religious people who are interested in ritual, I think many of them aren't. And if we could do a comparative study of those types of people and really look at like health and well-being outcomes and meaning and purpose in life, I think that would be a really interesting study.
So, what have you been surprised by? Like, just from doing your research?
I think so. So I'm working on a book project right now about it's a comparative case between the Sunday Assembly, which is really just an atheist church, and then the transhumanist church, the Church of Perpetual Life. And I think when I went into studying secular congregations, I was interested in these like why are people doing this? Like why are people interested in rituals? What do these places look like? What's motivating people? But what really caught my attention over the course of the last few years was how central this like sacralization of science is. And so that I think, I don't know if it's, I guess, yeah, it surprised me like that we would have a whole service celebrating Carl Sagan. I thought that was interesting and surprising, and like what to like revere scientists in that way, and to sort of use science to create rituals, and to say like science says I can, have this kind of spirituality, so I'm going to follow it. I think that has been really interesting and surprising to me, especially given most of the narrative around what science does for people. Science usually is seen as like this rational, logical, non-emotional space. But in these secular congregations, it is like it is the center of the meaning that is being made, sort of the scientific worldview, the celebration of scientists, the celebration especially of like space exploration, thinking about, where we came from and where we're going as sort of this chaotic event. That is really central to a lot of the meaning. Or in the transhumanist space, right? That science can, give us immortality, essentially. So this sacralization, I'm arguing, like most of them would say, I don't think science is sacred, but I do think that they're sort of embodying sort of sacred practices around science, and looking to science as sort of this ultimate good and this ultimate sort of progress, that I think is interesting. And I'm thinking now through like what are the consequences, both good and bad, of what that might mean, and what it means to like think of science in more of an emotional and ritual based kind of way.
Yeah, that is interesting. I never would have expected that. And I think it's because just my understanding of what science is, like it's a way to attain knowledge and a way to achieve certain goals that we have and meet our needs in, but not necessarily in a good way. Right. Like a science itself, I don't see, I see it as an instrument. It has instrumental value, right? So it depends on what the end goal is. Like you could employ science to come up with the most lethal weapon, right? Like that. So to kind of turn science into something that's sacred seems odd to me. Like you would have to import other values into it. You can't get it just from the science itself.
Right. I think on one level they would agree with you. But I think and so if you think about science's instrumental value, like Max Weber was all about making the argument that like science is, yeah, like it's an instrumental thing. We don't make decisions around science that are based in emotion or affect or religion or tradition. Science is, its own end, or it's the means to an end, right? But for a lot of these secular congregants, especially the transhumanists, science is sort of the ultimate end. So like it's not like, so like if I ask them, well, if everyone lives forever, what about overpopulation, or what about, resource management? And their answer is always, well, science will solve that. Right. So it's like it's valuing science for its own sake rather than the specific end that it can get you. Right. And I think that's where it shifts away from it just being instrumental to like science is the solution to all of the problems, and is also what I find meaning in, because I celebrate scientists, but also, right. So like there's a couple layers to it, I think.
Yeah. I don't know if these secular congregations will get that popular. The more I think about it and the more I hear about them, I don't know if they're that appealing. The fact that there's no one unifying doctrine, I think is I don't wanna say detrimental, but I think it makes it harder for them to become very popular. So, for instance, like, I remember talking to one of my Catholic friends, and he was saying, like, like, I can go to any country and go to a Catholic service and feel like I belong.
Right.
Like, they're all the same, they're structured the same, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, that is kinda true. Yeah, that's true." Whereas Protestants, I don't think that's necessarily true because there's so many different denominations, and I think I don't know, but this is my guess, is that there's a lot more church shopping, right? Like,
Mm.
they just kind of, like, try to find a church that aligns with their political values more, right? Because there's more variety, right? And so for something like secular congregations, that might be true as well. And so because there's no unifying doctrine, this church in this corner is the transhumanist one. And while I'm not really interested in living forever or uploading my consciousness to the cloud, right? And over here, it's the LSD one. I'm like, well, I'm not really interested in LSD either, right? So there's not that unifying force. So I think because of that, I don't think it can get that big.
I mean, I think in what I've seen that like at least over the last 15 years, I mean, it hasn't grown exponentially or anything, but there has been, I think there's a longer historical narrative to think about, and so I'm hesitant to say what could potentially happen in the future. So in the 1800s, there were a lot of secular congregations. There was I can't remember. I think like the Secular Society in Portland, Oregon. There was August Comte actually created a positivist church of science. So there was like this big movement in the 1800s, late 1800s, to have these secular congregation type spaces. And this is when we started seeing the Unitarian Universalists and the ethical societies. But then, like in the like mid 1900s, late 1900s, we start to see the rise of the religious right, and there was a concerted effort to really shun any religious, like non-religious organization. And so all of these like really political organizations around atheism started to grow in response to the religious right. But then we got new atheism, and that was its own thing. And now we're seeing the re-rise of secular congregations in response to the new atheists and sort of disillusionment from that particular form of atheism. And so now I don't know like what's to come next, right? I think we're seeing the rise of Christian nationalism and the consequences of that. And I think the backlash to that could be, a more political atheism again, or it could be increased interest in secular congregations. I don't really have a good sense of what that would be, but I think it's not just necessarily like what's happening with the atheists. I think what the atheists are doing is often in response to these larger sort of, national and international, forces that kind of shape what's even available, right? So you can't go to a secular congregation everywhere because atheists aren't allowed to exist in a lot of places, right? And so it's of a different nature. I mean, of course, Catholics are also discriminated against in certain places, but it's illegal to be an atheist in a lot of places, and so I think and it's still very discriminated against to be an atheist in the United States context, even. And so I think like the availability and whether or not people feel comfortable, taking on the stigma of being someone who goes to an atheist church, I think is very different than like just choosing between a Catholic or a Protestant church, at least in the United States, because those are not stigmatized religious groups, right? So I think there's all that other stuff to think about. But I think you're right that like without that central, like all powerful, like right and wrong doctrine, it is difficult to, sustain something like a church. I think I've seen that definitely happen. And also, most of these secular congregations are nonprofits. And so they're startups, and there's not a lot of money. And the only money they're getting is donations from people who come. And so that's why a lot of the chapters of the Sunday Assembly, for example, have failed, not because people weren't interested, but because there just wasn't any money and everyone had day jobs and it was hard to run. And so like any nonprofit. And so at the Catholic Church, people are paid to run that organization. There's a lot of money there. So I think there's so many different factors, but I do think that lack of central doctrine is one of them for sure.
I remember years ago, I went to an Easter celebration at a mega church because one of my friends invited me, and I was shocked. I was shocked. Well, I didn't know first, I didn't know that it was gonna be a mega church. So we just arrived into this, like, ginormous building that had its own coffee shop, gift shop, and daycare center, right? And when you go into, what is it, the sanctuary, it was like a small Vegas production. Like, the amount of money that went into that church was insane to me, and it must have been even more extravagant because it was Easter celebration, but they had, like, smoke machines, they had, like, huge, huge flat screen TVs, like, at least 3 of them, They had their own trailers for upcoming sermons or something like that. There was a
Wow.
guy, like, pretending to be Jesus, he's walking down the
Mhm.
aisle, he got these, like, Romans, like, whipping him, "Wah-cha, wah-cha." Like, it was like a
Mhm.
Vegas production.
Right.
It blew my mind. And then I went to a Catholic Easter service, boring as hell, super boring, probably a lot cheaper,
But a
okay?
beautiful space.
Yeah, it is a beautiful space. It was, the
Yeah.
Basilica in St. Louis.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's really nice. But yeah, I thought it was interesting just to notice the contrast between these 2 things. Now, I'm trying to imagine what the secular version of that would be, and
Yeah,
I don't
exactly.
know.
And that's so, like, if you're like, Auguste Comte did try to come up with this, so he was thinking of, like, positivist colors and having, like, busts of philosophers and scientists throughout the space and having, like, robes and vestments with like scientific symbols on them. So his like positivist church in the 1800s was like the best example I can think of that. Or like really trying to do the aesthetics of a religious congregation. And a lot of the secular churches that I have been to would like to have a bigger space, but there's no money, right? So the one that I did my dissertation on, they were meeting in the basement of the Unitarian Church for the first year. And they talked about like if we had our own space, then maybe it would maybe feel more like a place people could come and feel like home, but we're just like sort of these like guests in another space. And so I think it was a problem, I think, for a lot of them that they thought that if they had an aesthetic and if they had their own building and they could build their own color scheme even, like that it would actually, and I think psychology does show that those kinds of things do shape how people think about a space and how welcome they feel. So I think that that is part of the problem, right? There isn't like an aesthetic of atheism necessarily to build from. And I would be interested to see like if that changes over time. For sure, that could be something to watch.
The congregation in St. Louis apparently is one of the most successful in America. Of all the ethical societies, I think either might be the most successful or the second most successful in terms of just number of members. The space is beautiful as well. It's a nice building. When I moved to Columbus, I was searching for a humanist community and I was hoping to find something comparable. It does not exist here. What I found was pretty pathetic. It was just like a group of like 8 people meeting at a restaurant, and I'm like, "Oh, this is
Mhm.
like, isn't attractive at all," especially because 'cause they're all much older than I was. I don't think that they are going to get that popular. In fact, I think they're probably gonna die out, and maybe there's gonna be some revival in the future again in response to some other national or
Mhm.
international
Yeah.
force.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear about the LSD church. What was that about?
I have never been. I've only read about it, but it is, I think there's a couple of them in the United States anyways. There's an article on The Conversation, the website that I was reading about this recently. But they're spaces where because if you are a religious organization, you can do drugs essentially, legally. And so I think some of it is that there is, they're taking on the church form because it allows them to do drugs legally in that space. But a lot of it, I think, is these groups that are doing healing through certain drugs and who are really sort of more spiritual in nature and doing taking drugs to induce spiritual experiences. So there's, the legal thing I think is maybe a big reason why they're churches. But I don't think it's, just to go do drugs with friends. It is like it's a ritual, spiritual space. But I see them as secular congregations because it's not a religion. It is just like different religious and non-religious people coming together to do drugs for whatever reason it is.
This aspect of spirituality I find very interesting. I'm not very spiritual at all, but I know some people are. And I can imagine there being an appeal to these congregations if they're open to spirituality, right? Because I think a lot of people do think that there's something like greater than them, that there's something that we can't really sense, at least when we're sober, right? And perhaps something like LSD or psilocybin can kind of open that door for us and then kind of access this higher realm of existence or something like that. And so maybe like that's the draw for some people. And this kind of like makes me think again, like there's just different interests and different types of people around, and there's not this one unifying thing, right? So like some people are going to be spiritual, like they're built that way, and they want to hang out with other people who are also spiritual, and they want to talk about their religious or spiritual experiences. So for instance, like think of all the like the woo woo people, right? Like the new agey people who I almost think that is like a church almost like that's almost like a religion. Some of the stuff that they say, like I remember I knew this person who thought that human beings used to be telekinetic. That's just what she truly believed.
Mhm.
And they have their own, like healing processes. They have workshops, they have certificates, right? And have you ever thought about that, like the comparison to like religion in comparison to like new agey stuff?
Some. So my interest in spirituality is more along the lines of thinking about what people are increasingly calling secular spirituality or That's usually there's some other language that people use, but this idea of, especially at these atheist churches, like atheists trying to have transcendent experiences, and a lot of them will use the language of spirituality to talk about those experiences. So it isn't like, yes, there's something greater, but that thing isn't supernatural. Like it could be, a connection to humans. It could be like, so a lot of them think about like when we die, we become atoms again and we like get, merged back into the universe, right? So it's a very materialist understanding of the soul, I guess. So like that kind of stuff, a lot of atheists will say is spiritual. And so like if you ask on a survey, are you spiritual? A lot of atheists will say yes, even though they don't have any beliefs in anything supernatural. And I think that there's this discursive shift happening, at least in the American culture, around what is spirituality. And there are this growing number of people who are spiritual but not religious. And that's a category that people just identify with now. And I think those folks are a little bit more prone to believing in more sort of supernatural or paranormal types of things that sort of a secular spirituality would be. But I think it's a spectrum there. And so the new age folks, I don't study very much or do much comparison there. But I think, they were the start of this shift away, this like separation of religion and spirituality that happened in, the 50s and 60s. And the new age folks, I think, really started that. And now the secular folks are taking it another step away from religion and the supernatural. And so I think my question is like, what is spirituality going to be in the next 15, 20 years, right? I think that there might be a rise of spiritual type churches and spaces, right? We're seeing the rise of like meditation centers and secular Buddhism and those kinds of things. And that seems to me a lot more popular than the secular congregations. Even in the secular congregations, they're doing mindfulness meditation stuff. And so that I think is a little bit more pervasive.
What does it mean when somebody says that they're spiritual? Does that mean that that they believe there's life after death or reincarnation or something like that? Like that's the affiliation that I have with that term
Mhm.
spirituality, but I feel like it's almost a placeholder, right? Like they believe in just something other than material existence, but they also don't believe in traditional religions, right? They're not
Right.
Protestants or Catholics or whatever. And so it's kind of like I'm not that, but there's still something here that I think
Yeah.
is true. And so I'm just
Yeah.
going to call it spirituality.
Yeah. Or, they do believe in sort of the Protestant version of God, but they don't identify as Protestant because they don't like organized religion, right? So I think it takes a lot of, but yes, I think a lot of it is like, I don't believe in this monotheistic stuff, but I do believe in something greater, for sure.
Other than meeting like these fundamental human needs, do you think that there are other benefits of having these congregations? Because I think a very traditional defense of religion is that religion makes people more moral.
I would argue that there's a lot of research that shows that that's not necessarily true. I think that religion and like atheism and religion are both meaning making systems about, who we are and what life means. And there's a range of morality across them. But in terms of like, rather than just meeting human needs, I think there is a push among the non-religious people, especially in the Sunday assembly, to become a space where volunteerism can happen through. So if we're thinking about ethics or morality or thinking back, giving back to the community, most volunteerism opportunities in the United States happen in church spaces, or if you think about like Habitat for Humanity is technically a religious organization. And so if you are an atheist, it can be difficult to find a place to do regular volunteering that isn't tinged with any religiousness to it. And I've interviewed a lot of atheists who are like, I would love to or I would love to volunteer through this space, but like they're Catholic and I'm, not interested in promoting that or whatever it is. And so there is a big push in these spaces to be, there's a monthly volunteering event. They were doing some secular therapy sessions for people. So I think in that way there is a push to at least not like just for show, but there is a push to show like religious people that like, look, we have, we're giving back to the community too. We are moral people too. We care about other people. We're invested in this shared community that we have. And doing this like church, doing it through this church structure does, I think, help that, right? If you're just meeting 8 people at a bar through a meetup group, it's a lot harder to like get plugged into a local like volunteering event than if you're an organization with a 501c and that kind of thing. So I think having that kind of structure does help in that way. And it does, I've talked to a lot of people who are, like, I'm not doing this just to show that I'm moral, but I do think it's good that we're showing that we can be, we can do the same things that religious people do.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think there is a correlation between the attendees of these secular congregations and their political leanings? I ask because I would say the vast majority of the people who attended the Ethical Society lean liberal.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, that's true for the Sunday Assembly, I would say, and I think it in sort of survey studies, atheists particularly, but non-religious people tend to be more liberal than religious people on a lot of issues. But like with anything else, there's diversity. At the Transhumanist Church, I would say there's a lot more libertarians there, than there are liberals or conservatives, a lot more independents, libertarians, those kinds of things. They're pretty anti-regulation, given the scientific advancements that they wanna see happening, and like the FDA isn't approving. There's a lot of discussion about that. So yeah, I would say that at least at the Sunday Assembly, the leanings were pretty. I haven't, studied all atheist churches. Were pretty liberal. But I think there's a lot of conservative atheist spaces, particularly online spaces. There have been some fallout from some of the bigger political atheist organizations around trans rights, around gay marriage, and those kinds of things. And so I think they lean liberal, yes, but there is a pretty wide range of political values to be found.
That'd be interesting to see a rise in conservative secular churches. I would just be interested in knowing what their beliefs were and what's motivating this type of like phenomena.
Yeah. I would yeah. I don't know. I think it would be an I think it's a hard line to walk because if you're thinking about a conservative atheist, that I mean, politically conservative, maybe, but like most of those types of atheists are pretty like anti-religious. And so to mimic a religious structure is something that they're really not interested in. And so I don't know that we maybe, but I just don't know that we would see the conflation of those two kinds of structures together. But maybe I think that would be interesting.
All right. Well, I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ethical Frontier. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/chenphilosophy.